But again, welcome everyone. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. It's my great honor, and it's such a really wonderful thing to be able to welcome a former student back to the University of Florida. And I know that most of you, all of you, are here this afternoon to see Allison Mitchell, a PhD candidate in history at the University of Virginia, present a talk today titled Battle for the Ballot, the Struggle for Voting Rights in Florida. But before we get into Allison's presentation, I just want to say a few words about the Julian Pleasance Travel Award. And of course, Allison is the recipient of this year's Julian Pleasance Travel Award. This is an award that we created a little over a decade ago to honor Julian Pleasance, who was a longtime director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. Dr. Pleasance was the author of many books. He was the recipient of numerous teaching awards. He taught at the University of Florida for almost 4 decades. And I don't have to tell you that he was a great storyteller. And he just loved oral history. He had a passion for it. He taught generations of oral historians in the US and in other countries. He was a very important member of the Oral History Association. We decided to try to do something in his honor, and something in a sense, to help carry on his legacy. So this is the Julian Pleasance Travel Award research presentation. Allison is going to talk to you about her research in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program archives, and we're going to have a great time. I do want to give her a proper introduction, and also to tell you, we also have another special intellectual and colleague and friend of the Oral History Program with us this morning, Dr. Sharon Austin, who is going to comment on Allison Mitchell's work and her research, her dissertation and progress. And that is very appropriate that Professor Austin from UF Political Science is with us this morning, because as you'll find out in a moment, Professor Austin and Ms. Mitchell have a long-standing professional relationship. So to give a brief introduction to Ms. Mitchell, of course, she is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Virginia. Her dissertation traces the history of political activism and efforts to combat voter suppression among Black Floridians. I cannot imagine a more timely research project. She received her Bachelor of Arts in History, cum laude, in 2016. At the same time, she received her Bachelor of Arts in African American Studies in 2016, summa cum laude. The title of her thesis was Trigger Fingers Turned to Twitter Finger, African Americans' Utilization of Social Media Within Modern Day Activism. Her senior thesis advisor was none other than Professor Sharon Austin. So we're really excited. Not only are we bringing back a distinguished alumni to the University of Florida, we're having a kind of a reunion, if you will. Allison also did a lot of work with the Oral History Program when she was an undergraduate here. She helped us organize our Mississippi Freedom Project summer trip, and she also did a lot of transcribing and interviewing for us. And with Professor Sharon Austin, what kind of introduction can I offer a dear friend and colleague? She's the author of numerous books. She's a professor of political science. She earned her PhD at the University of Tennessee. She's just a powerhouse intellectual. She is a tremendous presence on campus. She's won numerous teaching and research and scholarly awards. And so the run of show today will be that Ms. Mitchell will begin with a presentation. I understand that she does have a PowerPoint to share with us. And then Professor Austin will provide a commentary on Allison Mitchell's presentation. I'll kind of come back and we will let the two of them interact. And then we'll go directly into Q&A. So if you, please, I encourage you in the audience, if you have questions, kind of think through them, put them in the chat bar, and we'll collate those, and we'll get ready to have a really good Q&A after Allison's presentation and then Dr. Austin's commentary on that presentation. So again, welcome to the presentation by Allison Mitchell. And I'm going to go ahead, Adolfo, and put myself on mute. Thank you very much.
Alrighty. One, thank you guys for having me. As Dr. Ortiz said, SPOHP and Dr. Sharon Austin collectively have been pivotal into getting me where I am right now. Just based on Ortiz and Dr. Austin's work, you can see where my influence lies. And so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here. Now, my project, as he referenced, is from 1944 to present. But this presentation will be looking at mainly 1950s going into 1960s, prior to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And my reasoning for doing that is I believe in this moment, Florida is really attempting to, well, Black Floridians anyway, are really attempting to figure out what are the next steps. And a major moment happens in 1951, and that's the assassination of Harriet and Harry T. Moore. And so for this presentation, I want us to just think about how they had to regalvanize themselves and what potential was in that moment as they moved into the 1960s. And so I'm going to share my screen. So on February 25th, 1952, the Collier newspaper published an article about Black voting rights in the US. They stated that today the Negro vote with relative ease in every state except Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida, where registration is still made difficult for them. It only took a little bit over a week before Florida governor at the time, Fuller Warren, and his cabinet to adopt a resolution demanding that the newspaper cease and desist publishing false and defamatory accusations against the Florida in the future. They doubled down on this proof that they believed that Black folk had the right to vote by sending out letters and telegrams from 64 of 67 registration supervisors. And these documents, the governor's office asked all the supervisors to reply to a poll to prove that there were no obstacles in their area preventing Black folk from voting. And as noble as Warren's declaration was in 1952, it came just a few months after the assassination of Harry and Harriet T. Moore. Now, they both were activists in their own right, known for their work for Black teachers and education. Also, Harry T. Moore putting in a big effort for the Groveland boys. But Harry was also the field secretary of the Florida State Conference at the NAACP and the president of the Voters League for a particular time. And while holding these positions proved difficult, and he would have some strife with the NAACP towards the end of his life, one thing about his activism remained sure, and that was a commitment to the idea that voting rights was an essential stepping stone to gaining equality. And this has been discussed by people like Caroline Evans. Her article, Somebody Has Got to Do That Work, Harry T. Moore and the Struggle for African-American Voting Rights in Florida. She points to the idea that between 1948 and 1950, a pivotal moment in his activism, the percentage of African-American voters in Florida increased from 16.9% to 31.7%. And it's without question that this activism was pivotal. So when the Moores were assassinated in 1951, it really struck a chord for the state. And mind you, this happened at the very tail end on Christmas Eve. So going into 1952, it was only a few months. And this struck a chord because Florida already had a history of racial violence. And this racial violence has been documented since the end of slavery by people like Tamika Bradley Hobbs in her book, Democracy Abroad, Lynchings at Home, where she reminded us that between Reconstruction and up until after World War II, Florida had the highest per capita of lynching, as well as the third highest of total lynchings in all states. So while Harry T. Moore's continued effort to promote voting rights and political participation among Black Floridians up until his assassination was pivotal, one thing for sure is it also proved that what Governor Warren was saying was not true. Black Americans in Florida were still struggling to have the right to vote. And we see what happens to people who push against this idea and push against any idea of, push against any idea trying to take away rights from Black voters and Black people in general. And this was not just a Florida story. And I hope as you guys are listening to this, none of this feels like just a Florida story, because what was happening here garnered commentary from Black people monitoring US politics and racial terror in the South collectively. And for an example of this would be Gordon B. Hancock, who in his syndicated article, Between the Lines, he hoped to use this moment as a way of, quite frankly, discouraging Black voters from voting for people that he didn't feel that were supportive of them. One of these people being Eisenhower. And so when talking about his ideas around why he felt Eisenhower would not be beneficial for Black voters, he emphasized that those supporting him were among of the Southern Democrats. And the people he referenced was U.S. Senator George Smathers and Spencer Holland, people whose name may sound familiar to those, particularly as I too went to the University of Florida. And he talked about them in tangent with Harry Timor's death and Harriet's death. But more importantly, he made clear statements. Florida is the South in miniature, he says. And what is transpiring here is a pattern of what the South is planning in an effort to keep the Negro in his place. And for many people like Hancock, it was important to connect the racial terror that was happening in Florida, the ones that specifically targeted political activists, as well as being tethered to the future of Black Americans in the US and in US politics. And in a broader sense of things, we've seen this earlier history even discussed in politics and work like Dr. Ortiz's groundbreaking work, Emancipation Betrayed. We understand that Black folk, particularly in the 1940s, chose voting activism and how that voting activism led for a gateway to the later movements we see in the 50s and 60s. And Florida is no different than this. But the way in which Florida, NAACP, and other groups had to regalvanize themselves and understand what the next move was, I think is a very a big moment. It has the potential for us to kind of investigate how we think about voter registration and increasing political participation. And so on the surface level, organizations like the NAACP began working to revitalize their chapters and initiatives in Florida. That is without no doubt. And in July 10th, 1952, just 7 days after the doctors pronounced Harriet Moore dead in the hospital, the organization announced that they'd be hosting a meeting of Southern leaders and local and state branches in the city of Jacksonville, Florida. And this was intentional. With the attendance of over 200 delegates from 14 states, they held this meeting to discuss first and foremost, how to increase the number of Black Southern voters in total. But two, also how to organize against racial violence, school segregation, and just help increasing their membership. And they also realized they needed a new field secretary. And so in the same moment, they would lean on Robert W. Saunders, and they would lean on him to replace Harry T. Moore and the NAACP's field secretary. Now, Saunders was a Florida native through and through, but he came back because they wanted someone from the area who was familiar. And when he was sent back to the state, they also sent Paul Perkins a few months later. Now, Perkins was worked with the organization's Political Action Institute. And that was the sole purpose of helping strategize ways to increase voter registration and turnout in 1952. And so I have Robert W. Saunders up here as an example from the USF Libraries, but I also have Edward D. Davis. And Edward D. Davis is important because he becomes the president of the Florida Voters League, and he's pivotal throughout several years in working to maintain the league at the state level. And so as they're trying to figure out ways to regalvanize themselves, they also see this as a moment and a particular moment for opportunity. Mainly because, one, at the state level, Florida politicians themselves are struggling and trying to figure out ways to deal with apportionment. Now, this may seem like I'm going on a tangent here, but apportionment is important because for Florida at this time, Florida was apportioned in a way where white wool leaders maintained major political control of the state. And it's at one point that this small portion of the legislature was, quite frankly, making like the major decisions in the state as a whole. And so in context, apportionment meant that majority of the legislation officials were also being elected by like roughly 1/5 of the state population. And they would struggle with apportionment until 1964, up until when the Florida actually changed its constitution. Now, so through all these moments, as they're attempting to galvanize people and kind of organize themselves, we see a development over time, which is a steady increase. And so what you guys see here is from the NAACP papers. And they're roughly using the 1950 census. They see that from 1950 to 1954. There is a steady increase, 18,233 people roughly added to the ballots, right? And so as we look at this history in a broader scope, Florida becomes one of those states where they see that slow progress, and it becomes a place that they're like, okay, well, there is progress here, but it's steady, and it's steady for particular reasons. And even though it's steady, it's also doesn't really answer a lot of the questions that are raised around what is political engagement and what is voting going to lead to for Black people in the South. And so these are two problems that are referenced in the 1950s that need to be wrestled with. One is the reality that, sorry guys, my computer is acting strange. One is the reality that, sorry, there's something, yeah, there you go. So one thing is the reality that the increase of Black Americans' registration and voting did not guarantee a change in white political ideology. And Harry Lee Moon of the NAACP brings this into full hindsight at a conference at Fisk University. And he references this, and this becomes a continuous throughout my entire dissertation, where Black folk aren't really feeling fully ingrained in this new development of the Democratic Party in the South. We're thinking of political realignment here. And he says, although the Democratic politicians in the South are becoming increasingly aware of the importance of the Negro vote and are somehow now openly soliciting it, only slight headway has been made towards integrating this new voter into the established party structure. And I just want us to keep that in mind when I get to more the end of my presentation. Now, on the ground level, the second point was just a reality. No organization had the funding or manpower to successfully implement a statewide voter registration drive. The NAACP announced that they wanted to do one. The Voters League of Florida, they also announced, or the Florida Voters League also announced that they wanted to do one. But in reality, and in confidential, in letters, Robert F. Saunders tells director of branches, and he throws a little shade at the Voters League. But he says, however, despite the loud claims of the group, which met in Ocala to organize on a statewide basis, in which Mr. Davis is president, no group is equipped to do a good job. And so how do we get this slowly steady increase of Black registered voters when there in fact is just not the manpower or the financial power? And I also want to keep in mind, I started with Harry and Harry T. Moore's assassination because that did put a lot of fear in a lot of people, and a lot of groups pulled away from activism altogether because they did not want racial violence to be the outcome. And so what they do is they navigate what I'm calling and what has been called a decentralized state. Now, this point was made by Hugh Douglas Price, and he did a case study in 1957 about Southern states, and particularly a case study of Florida. And he said some Southern states, statewide Negro voting leagues have proved effective, but not in Florida. But then he goes on to say why we feel like we have an increase. And that's because what's happening here in this organizing is a reflection of the success at which local Negro leagues had adjusted themselves to decentralized politics characteristics of Florida. And so when we talk about Florida being kind of an amalgamation of different things, Black Americans and Black Floridians in particular knew this, and they start to navigate it in that way. Now, the only issue with this is it doesn't always come out as even. And so the example I have here is the way the NAACP tried to assist Gadsden County in these earlier years versus Orange County. In Gadsden County, they placed 2 AME ministers in charge. This could be something that seems great because you're working with the local community, but we'll see later that Gadsden has a serious struggle where core members actually go into that county and help still revitalize voting. This is different than Orange County, where they send a voter registration specialist, W.C. Patton, to assist Orange County nonpartisan registration committee. So Orange County already has kind of its own establishment, and so they're able and they're willing to give them that kind of level of assistance. So what does this mean? You see numbers rising in certain areas, but not necessarily rising as much in others, but that's not being accounted in how Florida is being perceived. But also let's keep in mind that Black folk on the ground are very much aware of this, which is why I wanted to use a quote that I took from Charles Chestnut III, oral history done here at SPOHP, where he later is a part of that group in the later 60s doing work with the NAACP youth who have a funding to push a voting drive. But he still reflects that it was earlier work by a gentleman named L.V. Davis that really, started, and he was a member of the Florida Voters League, that really started the political movement for the Black community and really getting people out to vote. So the beliefs around this, even if people weren't necessarily bringing the numbers, the desire to vote, participate, and to have political power, which is essential here, was always there. But on the other hand, another issue with this, and also as well, I've forgot to mention really quickly that, Edward D. Davis also plays another role in giving funding and a lot of financial funding. So a lot of the papers that I see that are kind of in tangent with NAACPs is him helping shift and give money. So a lot of this is a level of autonomy for local communities, which does play out unevenly, but still leads to a steady increase in voter registration. But within this too, there also is a level of violence that still occurred. And the example I picked to discuss with you guys today was from the Miami Times. And I picked this in particular because I think a lot of what's happening in this moment, we like to look at just only rural spaces as having problems. And I also want to point out, and I'll go back really quick to my very first slide, this is a picture of Tallahassee, but this also was how different voting stations in Miami looked. They were diverse. But this doesn't always mean that they were equal. And so what happens in 1956 is Albert Miller is arrested in Miami right at the beginning of the closing hours of voter registration office that he was volunteering at. And he was arrested promptly by Carl Jones Jr., who was the supervisor of elections at the time. And Miller was a part of coordinating for Black registration, particularly for a group called the Citizens Committee on Registration. As I mentioned, not everyone had a particular, they all had their own different factions and groups. And so Holmes had Miller arrested on the accusation that he was short-circuiting Black citizens into registration lines before they had reviewed their precinct number. And this would seem necessary, to ensure that they were only registering in a place where they were meant to vote, particularly that area, which is why precinct numbers are important. Miller, however, knew that the reason Holmes had arrested him was different. Miller had been successful and efficient in assisting Black folk at that registration office for a whole week, and he did not plan on stopping. And so days before his arrest, Deputy Brown, who was stationed there at the registration office, had confronted Miller about his daily presence in the office. And once Miller expressed his role as a coordinator, Deputy Brown became offended, exclaiming that, it was his job to survey voting registration and that Black people had the opportunity to register equally here. Now, we know, and also we see in later years, unfortunately, it's not unheard of that law enforcement are placed at stations, voting stations and registration offices. Still, they're almost exclusively white. And there is inequality among how they're engaging with the actual registers. And Miller points this out because he witnesses unequal treatment between Black and white people while there. And one of the examples he calls on that's in the newspaper is that he recalls witnessing a pregnant Black woman in the same condition as a pregnant white woman, but the way they were treated was differently. And so the Black woman was forced to wait in long registration lines, while when a pregnant white woman came to register, she was pulled aside and her process was expedited. And he felt like little things like this were a part of the problem. And also is not to mention that Carl Holmes, the supervisor, in earlier years when they had segregated lines, was known for showing inequality, having maybe one or two people working with Black folk and 5 or 6 with white. So he has a history of being discriminatory. But that didn't matter. And so when Deputy Brown arrested Miller, he was later released on bail for roughly $100. But it is to be noted that when he was released, he was placed under consistent medical care stemming from the treatment he experienced while in jail. And there's still more about that story that needs to be teased out, because why was he experiencing violence? And a lot of times we see these places that are interracial, people working together, that doesn't mean equality is necessarily there. And then we have more traditional examples, such as what's happening in Liberty County. And so in Liberty County, at one point, they had 12 registered Black voters. But only a few days after that, crosses were burned on the lawn in 2 separate houses that had crosses on them, but also gunshots were peppered at a third house. And this was after about 10 people had went to vote. So they had 2 people on the registrar and then 10 more had came. But due to the violence and quite frankly, the pressure, 11 of them would later go back about 2 months later and ask for their names to be struck from the voting records at all. And when I circled here very small is a little 1, because this is the registration data collected by the NAACP. And you see for Liberty County, you see 1 colored vote. And that's because only 1 woman stayed on the registrar. However, this woman no longer resided in Florida and in fact lived in New York. And of course, through all of this, there was an investigation done by the local sheriff and also, the Collins is now becoming governor, I believe, at this point. So he's also called to speak on it as well, but nothing's really done. They say they can't find anything. And so this is a space that Florida's in. We see progress, but we also see limitations. And on top of that, this voter registration isn't developing into a way that makes Black Americans fully ingrained into this party. And the reason I center a lot of the Democratic Party here is because it takes a while until you see that transition, but Southern Democrats and the ideal of a Southern Democrat is very much present here. But we see a shift into the moderate as well. And the moderate comes about when we see Governor Collins and what's happening in the student movement. Now, this is like probably one of the coolest pictures of Patricia Stevens, and soon later to be Patricia Stevens do. But this is her working at a boycott. And she would later become one of the leaders of CORE and working in the North Florida voter registration projects in 1964. And the reason I work to tie what's happening in the student movement to the later movement there is because in this moment as well, when students are pushing the biggest amount of direct action, you have this idea of race relations committees developing, and they develop under Collins. And so what their goal is to do is to stifle activism. And in many ways they do. Now, in certain ones, there is success, but what it does is it kind of shifts our history. And so these are just two examples, one being from Miami Herald, another later from the Orlando Sentinel, where they're talking about like this end of segregation in a peaceful way in these areas. And we know that's not necessarily the case, right? But this development of an idea, almost like a racial liberalism, if you will, helps create the narrative that Florida is this progressive era. And that's very much in tangent with voter registration. But what happens in North Florida with Patricia Stevens do and others is that they're kind of looking at a bigger possibility here and really thinking about what voter registration and voting activism can lead to and political participation can lead to at a grassroots level. And moving forward in my work, and I don't necessarily have it here on the slide, but I've been thankful to collect a lot from SPOHP. One of those being works by a scholar who wrote, Dr. Button, who wrote a book in the 1975, where he interviewed Black leaders who would later become, city commissioners, mayors, school board members, et cetera. And he interviews them and talks about what do they think as elected officials happened after 1965. And I've been going through these, and what I've noticed is some of them and a great deal of them are not connected to that civil rights movement. Now, some of them are, but a lot of them aren't. So my question is, I want to understand, when we look at the progress of 1965, how much from the civil rights era and the idea around voting during that era is actually implemented later after 1965, and in tangent with the 70s, as we see a lot more local Black politicians. And I feel like this affects our idea of what representation actually means as well. That's something I can definitely speculate more in the Q&A. And I also believe my time is up. So with that being said, thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. Now it's my distinct pleasure to welcome my colleague, Professor Sharon Austin from the Department of Political Science at the University of Florida, to provide commentary on Allison Mitchell's research presentation this afternoon. Dr. Austin?
All right, I'll try to be as brief as possible because I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions, but just this morning I was working on some information about voting in Florida and just looking at the historical disfranchisement of Black voters in Florida, especially in the North Central area, like you referred to Gadsden and in those communities. And even now, Florida continues to be a topic of discussion because of different things that are happening in the state. So I guess my question to you is related to something that we just talked about in my African-American politics class right before the semester ended. We were talking about Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams, and the fact that Andrew Gillum in 2018 only lost by 0.4% of the vote, less than 1% of the vote. So if the turnout had been just a little bit higher among the people who supported him, he would have won. He would have been Florida's first Black governor. So I guess my question to you, in thinking about your research, what advice would you give to young people who don't believe that they should vote?
That's a really good question. And it's one I've thought about a lot because, I mean, I don't want to necessarily tell my age here, but I'm 27 and I do have colleagues who feel that way. And we debate about this a lot in a good, healthy debate. But my understanding, and I'll reference this in the context of the research I've done. So I've interviewed quite a few dream defenders. And a lot of the efforts that they talk about is, even though a lot of them see themselves as full abolitionists and ways of navigating, the language that they use is organizing against the institution, within this institution, and around the institution. And I think that's a big proponent of it. I think some people feel like if you don't want to participate, there's only another option. But understanding who you're fighting against, or who you're trying to deal with in your space as you're organizing, is important, which is why, if we be ever honest with ourselves, organizing around the ideas of an Andrew Gillum, it's going to look a lot different than organizing with a DeSantis, right? And I think that's something that just needs to be a conversation. That's not to say that voting is the only answer, but it's to understand why people continue to vote and what are your long-term goals can be in alignment still, if you are, even if you are skeptical of participating.
Right, because I mean, that is one challenge, especially for younger people. Older people vote at higher rates, but older people tend to have totally different views, and they also prefer candidates that are totally different from the candidates that young people prefer. And so for young people, if you really want to have a say in politics, or to be able to elect the person that you want in office, you really do have to vote. But the challenge is in trying to convince young people to vote, because I guess they have reason to be pessimistic when they see various things that are not only going on here in Florida, but just across the nation. But that's one of the challenges, is getting young people to vote. And then also, if you remember, you've taken several of my classes when you were in undergrad, and including the seminar. And in my classes, I talk about African-American men and women. So why do you think women, like you referred to Patricia Stephens do and Harriet Moore, why do you think Black women like them have not received more attention for the efforts that they made, not only for voting rights, but just for civil rights just in general?
In my personal thing, I think a lot of it has to do with how much we emphasize, and my goal is to work harder to be more cognizant of this, but how we emphasize the idea of actual leadership positions. While Patricia Stephens did hold a position in CORE as a secretary for the Northern Voter Registration Project, a lot of the work and the people she's working with, they don't necessarily have positions, but they're the ones doing the groundwork. And I also feel like a part of this is why oral histories are so important, because it's usually when you get those names, you continue to go door to door. You talk about people, how they go door to door and what they do with trying to get registered voters. So I think a lot of that is going beyond the text. And so, moving forward in my own work, I hope to do that more, to try to shed light on a lot of the women, because people pushing this forward are Black women. Even if you look at the activism in current day, a lot of these leaders are Black women, and they continue to be, because they're galvanizing beyond their own ideas and what they want to see better in the world. Yeah,
because I'm looking at the real nice picture you have of Ella Baker, and we talked about her in my African American politics class, and I was just shocked, so disappointed that very few people had ever heard of her. And we also read a book about Fannie Lou Hamer, and a lot of students had never, I would say probably only about 40% of the class knew who she was even. So now you're seeing Black women who are in Black Lives Matter and in other types of movements who are at the forefront. But traditionally, it's always been a case where the women were the organizers, but the men were the leaders. And so you've heard of men like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but you've not heard of women like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, Patricia Stephens even here in Florida, Harriet Moore here in Florida. You've not heard very much about them. So that's one of the major shortcomings of history. And then, so another question, and I'm not going to take up too much time, but I want to make sure that I leave plenty of time for the audience to ask questions. But, we still have evidence of voting discrimination and voter suppression today, and that's unfortunate. But I guess the question is, why is it that when you think, is it more difficult to prove in today's society than, because back then people would just come out and just say things, but in today's society, people use more coded language and racial code words. So what are the challenges, I guess, of trying to prove voting discrimination in today's society? And that'll be my final question. And then I know the audience is looking forward to asking questions, but what are some of the challenges?
That's a great question. And I do think a lot of it is subverted, but I also think so an example I can talk about is when we talk about voting, an idea of voter, polls and et cetera, we also have to have a conversation about the makeup of spaces and how racialized and segregated particular spaces are, because a lot of that has to do with what polling station you go to. And so when you see things like that, well, you can, we got to the point where it's like, oh, it's a Black polling station that has longer lines, X, Y, and Z, but that's their polling station for their neighborhood. So I think a lot of the stuff is actual development in space. I think a lot of the subversions we see in the idea of little minute things. And I know some people would argue, well, if you really care, you'll be okay with taking off time from work or doing different things like that, X, Y, and Z. But we've seen even in this pandemic, people come out when they're given opportunities, because the fact is voting should not be strenuous. The idea of picking a candidate, there should be no speed bumps in your way. And I think that's a problem. People forget that this is a right that you are given, that you have. It's not necessarily a privilege. And I make that very clear, even talking with my own students. It is a right you have. So when you make smaller, unnecessary speed bumps, to me, that's a problem. So it becomes that subversion. And so, I think I said a part of that is just, like I said, making those smaller things difficult. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Yeah, it definitely answers the question, because voting is something that, we should encourage people to vote and make it easier for people to vote rather than making it harder. And as you mentioned, especially here in Florida, whenever there are problems on election day, especially with presidential elections, like thinking back even to 2000, when it was just really horrible here in Florida, the machines are more likely to break down in minority neighborhoods. The lines are longer as a result of that in minority neighborhoods. And now you even have a situation where until a recent decision, you can't even give water to someone who's waiting in a long line. Early voting is harder. Mail voting is harder. And there are constant court challenges to those types of things happening here and in other states as well. But anyway, so the last thing I want to do, go ahead.
I do want to add to that part too, because I think what's important about that as well is that even though I'm talking about this and we're talking about this and understanding Black voter participation, what the things that you're naming and suggesting are also something that affects other groups, people with disabilities and other things as well. And so this history of Black voting can really show and demonstrate how a lot of the suppression, it does not just harm Black folk, but it harms other groups and other minority groups. And particularly, like you said, your examples, people who have disabilities, people who need water or need to sit down, different things like that.
People who are elderly even, yeah, exactly.
People who are elderly, ageism, a lot of that plays a major role here.
All right. So I just want to make sure that I just again say how proud I am of Allison. She was my student here. I'll be hanging out with her next week. I'll be going to University of Virginia for the first time. And so I'm going to see her there. And then also I see the names of a lot of my other current and former students. I want to also encourage you, as I do in my classes, to think about going to school and getting a PhD, because of all the work that you can do here at UF with SPOHP, with me, with others on campus. And Allison is one of our best success stories. And she is going to be graduating soon. She talked about her students, and I'm like, wow, I guess I feel kind of old. And my student is now has students of her own, but I'm happy for her. And I see some names. One person, Taylor Hayes. I'm trying to get you to go to grad school, so I'll be calling on you pretty soon. So that's just one of the things that I want to end with. So Paul, if you want to go ahead with the chat, I know the audience has plenty of questions, and thank you all for allowing me to ask Allison some questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Austin. And what we're going to do, I have a couple of questions that folks have texted into me. We have some questions in the chat. If you'd like to talk directly to Ms. Mitchell, Adolfo Romero, who is facilitating the Zoom, has given us the permission. However, I'll ask you to just put your name in the chat so I can call on you in order, because there's about 50 people right now, and I just can't follow everyone. So if you want to directly ask a question directly to Allison, just put your name in the chat. It looks like Adam McNeil is up first, but a couple of texted questions, Allison. One question is obviously from a historian. So after all of this work by scholars like Larry Rivers, Marvin Dunn, Tamika Bradley Hobbs, to demonstrate that Florida in many ways is no different, in some ways worse in terms of race relations in the South, why do you think this myth of Florida progressivism and race relations continues to endure to this day?
So for me, I think that one's a twofold. One, I think we cannot underestimate the idea of Florida being this tourist state and what that means. So I've been looking at some records myself and the way that particular governors have talked in certain areas, example, like Miami, where it's like, people don't want a vacation where there's riots, and how they work to create a space where Florida is welcoming to taxpayer dollars, essentially. I think another component of that, what I do believe happens in that Leroy Collins era, in that 50s going into the early 60s, mainly because he is one of the more progressive governors. And when he goes on to work with LBJ, there's a lot and ideas published around him with this idea as like the new South and the new Southern Democrat. Now, within the context of that, I think when you emphasize the fact that Florida has subtle change over time, now that's not necessarily mean garnering major systemic issues, but the fact that they have subtle change over time, a lot of people just immediately kind of just ignore it as being the South. I think it's easy to ignore Florida as being the South if you're not from here. Not no shade to non-Floridians, but as somebody who grew up in Tampa, where I could drive to the beach, but I also drove past a large Confederate flag every day to school, I think a lot of times that idea of Florida as this tourist space, and also one of the areas where people were leading in. I mean, I'm thinking of Claude Pepper as well, people who were more progressive in their time in comparison to more Dixiecrats, if you will. I think a lot of that from a political standpoint has allowed people to kind of just undergird the issues in Florida. And also they continue to ignore a lot of these rural spaces and center those major urban developments like the Tampas, Orlando, Miamis, the Jacksonvilles that have always had a bustling Black population, and et cetera.
Excellent. The next question is about Patricia Stephens Dew. And I want to preface this by saying that the oral history program at UF is so honored to be able to continue to work with the Dew family. And a Save the Date event, which we will be putting on our Facebook and social media, is on May 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern time. John Dew, who's Patricia Stephens Dew's husband, who also holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Florida, along with Tanana Reeve Dew and Janita Dew, is going to be hosting a national webinar on civil rights struggles today. So that's going to be May 5th, 2 p.m. And we'll be putting out, just kind of look at the Proctor program social media feed. That's a late breaking event. We'll be having registration information. So the question, Allison, is thank you so much for talking about one of Florida's greatest heroes, the civil rights movement, Patricia Stephens Dew. Can you comment on a little more on Patricia's work in the movement, and also talk about the tensions and commonalities between groups like CORE, the NAACP, and other Black political organizations of the time?
No, definitely. So for those who don't know, essentially in the Voter Education Project, a lot of people most normally know what happened in Mississippi with SNCC, but CORE is a group that comes to Florida, and they work in Northern Florida in particular. Now, the organization itself first came to Miami, and the Dew sisters, Patricia and, Stephens sisters, Patricia and Priscilla, would go down there and they would learn about organizing and strategizing. And they came back to FAMU and they would organize in Tallahassee. And during this time, what is happening here, which I think is so prevalent about them too, is in other spaces where you have a lot of people who are coming out of town, they were very familiar with the area. And I've been able to listen to some of her oral histories here with SPOHP, and as well as her work on history makers. And she talks about going into spaces where she knew people. And even then, the contingencies between not wanting to get involved in voting rights. I think what's phenomenal about the work that she did is she's somebody not only just from the state, but she remains here and she continues to publish and write and talk about her work in the earlier years. And she's one of the people who I've watched continues to remind us to not get caught up on this idea that Florida is progressive. She continues continues to remind us of that. And their grassroots movement work, they set up their own stations in North Florida. They work to register voters. They pull people to the polls. They had the teach-ins. They did a lot of the stuff that we've learned about in different areas like SNCC, et cetera. And they were given funding to do so by the BPE, and that made a big deal because there is tensions. And the tensions, I think, that rise between spaces, groups like CORE, who are mainly grassworking students, and NAACP is, I think that idea of representation becomes a little convoluted and different in their ways. The idea of electing people, I listened to an interview from SPOHP by a woman of the last name Dixie, and she talks about her brother, who's a local man, and they're kind of pushing him to run for sheriff. And that looks a little different when you have in larger spaces that have more of an NAACP, where a lot of the people running are business owners in a particular way, or have some type of financial distinction about them, or in a different class rank. And I think a lot of that's where the issues come from. Now, I don't want to put these groups as completely opposing each other, because one thing is important is that a lot of the people who do join CORE and who do join and later work with SNCC, many of them were radicalized in their space as NAACP youth. I think that's a component of this that I don't want to go on a tangent on. But NAACP youth are a reference, or youth groups are referenced in different parts of Florida. And many of them later become a part of this more, I guess, radical, which I would argue, I think it's just them trying to make systemic change groups. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the question. And I will continue to dive more in that. But all the work that she did, I think that moment and what's happening up there could have been something to really reconsider the state of Florida. And I hope to argue that and not just be like, well, they're trying to help the rural backwards parts. Like, no, what they were emphasizing was a way that we need to think about community engagement in politics.
All right, thank you, Allison. And now we can go to the chat. Ken has a question. Please comment on the establishment and funding by Governor DeSantis of a state level investigation and enforcement unit. I believe this is around voting. And Allison, I don't know if you've been keeping up with Florida news recently.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say about DeSantis. I'm not sure how much I should directly comment on that. I think for me personally, the issues with DeSantis is I think a lot of how do I say this in a professional way? I think a lot of what he's doing, and I think even through this into the investments and one, let's be real, some of the things he's doing is a lot more fear mongering and this idea of just like social efforts, right? Certain things he knew and he's fully aware that we're not going to get pushed through, particularly ones that he knows are unconstitutional. However, he's doing this a lot for this idea of maintaining a particular base. One thing I will say about him is I do not think a lot of this is service level. I mean, they try to compare him to Trump and it's like, oh, I think he's a lot more calculated than that. And I think a lot of the angles and decisions that he's making is to, quite frankly, push his own future. I do think he wants to see himself in the White House. And I think a lot of what he's doing in Florida is to hopefully get himself there one day. And I'm going to leave it at that because like I said, I don't know how to talk about this without, quite frankly, just saying some very negative things. And this is recorded.
Thank you, Allison. Adam McNeil has a question he wants to put to you directly.
Yeah, good to see you, Dr. Ortiz. And Allison, great presentation, and looking forward to reading more about your work moving forward as you finish the dissertation. And so, you know, I'm a FAMU graduate, and so very happy to hear how you ended the discussion and also how the Q&A has already gone. So I'm actually interested about not only the student movement, but how extensive it was in terms of different organizations. So I know you spoke about CORE with Patricia Stevens-Dew. So I'm actually interested to know, right, you have that famous photo of Stokely Carmichael from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from '67. And so I'm actually interested to know how other organizations like student organizations like SNCC and others, how deep, if at all, did they get into the state of Florida, FAMU, you know, and the other universities that Black folks attended in the 1950s and 60s, so, or in the 1960s and 70s. So thanks again for the presentation. I'm looking forward to your answer.
No, yeah, definitely. So for this one, I would say a lot of it goes down to larger decisions made during the VPE era and when they're deciding to give students funding, because basically they're just like, guys, like I need y'all to stop protesting here, help people vote. During that time, there was a decision made of where organization would go. And so you see SNCC go into particular areas of Mississippi and later Alabama, but CORE came into Florida, and then CORE also goes to parts of Louisiana. So a lot of it is not necessarily that SNCC wasn't ever directly involved in Florida, but when it came to like direct organizing that was funded by the government to a certain extent, it was CORE. That's not to say that these movements weren't keeping in tangent with each other. A lot of the language, there's definitely comparisons in newsletters, particularly the Correlator. They kept in touch with a lot of things going on in Mississippi and drawing comparisons to their efforts in Florida to demonstrate that the struggle was just as prevalent there. But most of that is kind of a communication thing, not necessarily like there being major SNCC chapters in Florida, if that makes sense.
All right, thank you for the question, Adam. And we have time for just a few more questions as we're kind of beginning to wind down. I want to remind folks that we're here listening to Ms. Allison Mitchell, PhD candidate in history at the University of Virginia. She's giving the 2022 Julian Pleasance Travel Award lecture. I want to put some information in the chat bar about the Pleasance Travel Award in case anyone's interested in applying. This is an award that we offer every other year. In your chat bar, I put the URL directly to the award. You'll see some of the many distinguished past awardees, people like Professor Derek White, University of Kentucky, as a former awardee. And then, of course, Allison Mitchell will be added to that Pleasance Hall of Fame after this presentation. But really, y'all, I encourage you to apply for the award. Spread the word. The call should go out in the next month or so. We're probably going to have an early January 2023 deadline for that. And the Pleasance Travel Award comes with a $2,000 stipend to give you a little bit of incentive, and also research support from the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program staff. And the award is really designed to promote oral history research, such as the kind that Allison is engaged in, and also to really encourage people to use the oral history holdings here at the University of Florida, especially, but not limited to, the Joella Buchanan Archive of African American Oral History. This is an award-winning repository that Ms. Mitchell has used, obviously, very productively in her PhD research. So let's kind of wind down the last few questions. I have someone in the chat bar. Robert, I also see your question, which I'll read. But we have Sophia. Do you want to pose your question to Allison?
Yes. So my question is for Allison. Maybe Dr. Austin might relate a little bit to you as well. So I actually was researching the other day the Moors, and also noticed how much of the information I found was very centered on Harry Moore's work, and I really had trouble finding information on Harry Moore. And so I was just wondering, when we're doing our own individual research, whether it's for a project or just we're just learning, how did you kind of go about finding information and sources that centered the voices and the leadership of those Black women? Yeah, I guess that would just be my question.
Oof. That one is one I can say now historians are still struggling to do. A lot of that is also reading in between the sources. So if you, Sophia, as you find yourself starting to tap into larger archives and different things at larger institutions and holdings, a lot of that is going to kind of be up to you to kind of read between the lines and kind of understand exactly where the woman you're researching is in tangent with some of this work. So for example, I know with Harriet, like they had a serious struggle with them maintaining their jobs due to activism. So she actually later has to get a teaching job in a different space as well. And so when you look at little things like that, you would say, okay, well, she lost her job because of her husband's work. Sure. But understand that they both were in education. It's going to, it's going to be a level of reading against the grain and also pushing some ideas of speculation, which I know some historians are scared about, but I argue differently when it comes to trying to put women's voices into place. And so as you're moving forward, definitely work on how to engage sources, particularly primary sources, and when her name comes up, and kind of construct the narrative around her and where she is, particularly the location and things like that. So there's different tactics. And I definitely know a lot of historians working on women's history that could, if you send me an email, I can definitely direct you to them because they're a lot more helpful than me.
Yeah, that is very helpful. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sophia, the excellent question. And yeah, Allison, if you don't mind putting your email in case folks have additional questions, I know that would be very valued. So our penultimate question is from Robert, who asks, would you be willing to contrast the careers of Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum and the importance of being free from too many personal failings, especially if you seek to be the first in any endeavor?
No, definitely. I think there's a lot to unpack in this question, particularly the continued struggle of being the first when it comes to Black politicians, and the level of scrutiny and ideas that are placed on them and how they're supposed to maintain their lives. This is not to make any excuses of anything, but I think when we think about even electing people, the fact that we push them under this idea of the first, I think is a problem. Not to say that we should not be proud of having Black politicians, but what that means in a larger grand scheme of how they're going to be viewed during politics, right? I think with Stacey Abrams, a good decision and what she made is after the loss of the election, rather than she attacked the institution of how the elections itself. She attacked the voting, like the establishment of voting, and so I feel like we can compare them, but I think what makes them distinctively different is the aftermaths of their loss and her decision to push the idea of voting, and what was going on in Florida and the issues with Florida. And I want to be mindful too, the effort she made in Florida, we're not done alone. And she tweeted about this after people started giving her too much accolades. She was like, these are all the organizations who worked in tangent to ensure that voting increased and that we flip the state. So a lot of that, I think, regardless of being the first or their personal lives, a lot of that has to do with how do you actually engage with the ground level and organizing in a way that helps forefront. So I believe she's plans on running again, right? So how do you honestly, quite frankly, start to wrestle with the system itself to make it better for you? I think that's the biggest question here versus like their personal lives. Because the issues at play here is the system itself, and putting too much emphasis on them being the first only opens them up to more scrutiny. So I'm not sure if that got at the question there, but I guess if anything, I rephrased the parts that we should be thinking about. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Allison. And the last question will go to Cheryl, and I just lost the question here in a minute. Okay, here we go. So Cheryl asks, what do you think about gerrymandering? It seems like communities of color are usually affected by it. Do you think it will ever be abolished? Now,
do I ever think it'll be abolished? That one, I do not know. But I will say gerrymandering is a serious problem. It's something I bring up in later chapters, particularly looking at the ideas of racial gerrymandering as a big proponent of this. For me, the issues with gerrymandering is that, and I do think communities of color deal with it the most, not necessarily because we just all like vote very similar. I think when you make these, when we did racial gerrymandering, we have these racialized groups, right? The rest of Florida kind of becomes red, right? In particular spaces. And so for me, the issue with that gerrymandering that we see in that later, like that 90s era, is the fact that we're centering the idea of representation and not necessarily political power. Because racial gerrymandering will guarantee you maybe a Black politician, but it doesn't wrestle with the state as a whole as far as like the political dynamics. I do think Black folk deal with it the most because one thing gerrymandering is right and proponent with is hyper segregation. And I think we need to have a conversation about that as well. like when I talk about voting, and I talk about any aspects of voting, realize it's all these things are in tangent, like down to like the housing. I mean, people who do statistics on this now, and trying to understand what people and how they vote, they're down to street numbers now. We start thinking about data. And so, yeah, I think it's a really big problem. I do think Black folk deal with it the most, more than anyone. I think a lot of it has to do with the racial makeup of a lot of these spaces, and what exactly is to come about gerrymandering. What are the actual goals of gerrymandering? Because we can see it shifts back and forth, but it's never been done with the aspirations of Black people in mind. Even when discussing racialized gerrymandering, it's never truly been done with the idea of gaining them any form of like major power, because only even having a couple elected officials doesn't equate to them having major shifts in state legislation. And I think Florida is one of the places that we can talk about this the most. But yeah, I think it's a big deal, and I'm just not sure if it's gonna go away. Hopefully one day we can really deal with that. But right now, I mean, we still got people trying to stop us from going to the polls. So we're a work in progress.
All right, well, thank you so much, Allison, for really connecting the past, the present, and the future, for reminding us how important it is to not just study politics and do research, but actually participate in politics today. So before we formally close out, please join me in thanking and applauding Allison Mitchell for giving a wonderful 2022 Julian Pleasance Award lecture. Thank you so much. And our Assistant Director, Adolfo Romero, has placed contact information about the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program in the chat bar. We are a 24/7 university-based social justice research center. So please feel free to contact the Proctor program at any time. Right now, we are signing up folks for summer internships. And if you know of high school, college, retired folks, we really don't discriminate. As Allison can tell you, it's not unusual to come into Pew Hall some days and to see a high school student sitting down next to a World War II veteran, telling their story. And so we have a lot of space for folks who want to get involved in oral histories, whether you want to actually learn how to interview someone or whether you want to kind of stay behind the scenes and help make interviews happen on topics like the civil rights movement, the Holocaust, World War II, Latino working class issues. I mean, you name it, we probably have a research project on it. But before we officially close out, I do want to again thank Allison Mitchell, a history PhD candidate from UVA, a proud University of Florida graduate, for giving a wonderful Pleasance Travel Award presentation. And also my dear colleague and Allison's former senior thesis advisor, Professor Sharon Austin, for providing outstanding commentary. Again, everyone have a wonderful day. Please feel free to contact us at any time. And Allison will continue to watch your progress with a lot of pride and just a lot of hope, so that at some point, maybe Professor Austin and I can think about retiring. And we'll hand the load over to you, which you're going to take and just do wonderfully. So thank you.
Yes, and thank you all again. Like I said, I'm more than honored to be here. I would not be in this space without Dr. Sharon Austin and Dr. Paul Ortiz. So I'm more than grateful to just talk about my work, and hopefully it can turn into a wonderful dissertation. And thank y'all all for coming.
All right, thank you all, everyone. Be well. Have a wonderful day. Good luck with finals, everyone. Those of you taking finals.